Upcoming is a complete beginner's guide to raising dairy goats on your homestead naturally. We're going to be discussing how to decide on the right dairy goat breed for your homestead, what to feed your dairy goats for best milk yield, including important minerals that are often overlooked, how to mitigate common diseases and parasites in dairy goat herds, how much milk you can expect out of various dairy goat breeds, and more. Specific topics are time-stamped down below, and for a printable cheat sheet featuring the top 10 takeaways from today's discussion, click on the first link in the description of this video and I'll email it straight to you. We're going to be talking about raising goats, primarily focusing on dairy. A lot of this is going to apply if you're raising meat as well. A lot of it's going to cross over to sheep. Deborah Neiman authored this incredible book, which I have been enjoying this past month, Raising Goats Naturally. Grab yourself a copy. But we're going to be talking tonight about some frequently asked questions on behalf of beginners getting into dairy goats. Go ahead and drop in the comments for me, though, where you're joining us from, what state, and whether you own goats already or you're just here kind of to get a beginner level primer. So you touched on it a little bit. The lifestyle drew you in, but why dairy goats? Why dairy goats specifically?
Oh, I always say it was love at first bite when I had goat cheese for the first time when I was in college. But it was expensive. So when we started talking about moving to the country, I thought I needed to have goats so that I could have goat cheese. And I really thought that's all I was going to get from them was the goat cheese. Like that's how badly I wanted it. I thought cows were what you needed for all the dairy stuff and that we were just going to make chev, soft, creamy, spreadable stuff. But after we got goats, then I realized, oh my goodness, like this makes amazing yogurt. And I think the last count, we were up to 18 different kinds of cheese that we've made. And we make buttermilk and sour cream. And the only thing I'm not a big fan of with the goat milk is butter. Everything else, though, like you don't need cows.
So what were some of your primary challenges as a beginner raising dairy goats in those early days?
So in the beginning, it was really interesting because in the beginning, it was super easy. Like the first 2 years, it was definitely this magnificent honeymoon period where everything just went perfectly. We made the goat cheese, we made the yogurt, kefir. We made goat milk soap. Everything was perfect. The goats had their babies and they jumped up and started nursing. And I mean, there were no problems whatsoever. And then after 2 years, I bought a little buckling and brought him home. And within 2 weeks, he had died. When he went down, I rushed him to the university vet hospital and he died there a couple hours later. And we found out it was from worms. And this was like back in the early 2000s. And so then they're like, oh, well, you need to be giving a dewormer to your goats monthly. And so I did that. Like, I really didn't want to do that in the beginning. But I mean, it's like once you have an animal die, you're like, oh, whoa, this is terrible. Okay, I'm going to give them a dewormer. And then 4 months later, I had 2 more bucks die. Parasites became a really huge problem. And we wound up with complete dewormer resistance. None of the dewormers worked at all. So all I could do is sit there and just watch the goats die. And I tried all the things, and anything, if somebody said this kills worms, I did it. I tried all the different herbal dewormers, everything. Nothing worked. So that was like a really big problem that we had. The other thing that we had a problem with was copper deficiency. So we had goats that were not getting pregnant, not staying pregnant. They were giving birth prematurely. It was really not pretty. It was very depressing. The vets had no idea why it was happening. And ultimately, my oldest daughter at the time, she was like 16, thought she wanted to be a vet. So she was doing a lot of research for me. She said, Mom, I think our goats might be copper deficient. So I happened to be teaching at a university at that time. So I went into the scholarly literature and found some research on goat nutrition. And this was like emerging research. Goats need copper. So I always kind of feel like I started back in the dark ages with goats because they thought goats were just like sheep. They didn't really need copper. And that wasn't true. And in our case, it was like a triple whammy. They really weren't getting a mineral. The goat feed they were getting didn't have enough copper in it. And we had sulfur in our well water, which is a horrible copper antagonist. So they had it about as bad as they could get it. Finally, when we had a goat die, I said to the vet, I wanted to have her liver tested for copper. And he said, you're wasting your money. And I said, well, it's my money. And he comes back and like, it should have been between 25 and 150. And it was 4. Like, how did she even survive as long as she did? And she left behind these 2 kids that were only 2 months old, horribly copper deficient. And as it turned out, the one, I struggled with her for 4 years, and then she died of like mastitis and pneumonia together.
So when you found out of the copper deficiency, but what were the symptoms that kind of triggered you to consider that, or your daughter to consider that?
So copper is really, really important for the color in a goat's coat, which I had heard, and somebody had said to me, this was back in the days of the Yahoo groups before Facebook. And somebody had said to me, you know what? I think your goats might be copper deficient because their coats are really faded. Because like the black goats looked orangey and my gold goats were turning white and cream. And I was like, oh, well, who cares? Like, that's just cosmetic. I didn't realize like, oh, if it gets worse, it's going to be more than just cosmetic. So that's a big one. And then they lose hair in very specific places, like the tip of their tail, the bridge of their nose, around their eyes. Very specific hair loss. And then when it gets bad enough, that's when you start seeing fertility problems, goats not coming into heat, having silent heats, not getting pregnant, not staying pregnant, and giving birth prematurely.
So when you found that problem, how did you amend it? Some people are asking in the comments here, okay, if I have that issue, what do I do as far as supplementing for copper?
So there's a couple different things. First thing I did was I got copper oxide wire particles. Some people refer to them as copper boluses. So that's what I started with. And then after a few years, a vet suggested that I try multi-min. And I did. And what he didn't know and what I didn't know is that when you inject minerals into a goat, they pee out a lot of it within 24 hours. So 3 months after I gave this buck an injection of multi-min, it was supposed to last for 6 months. 3 months after I gave him an injection, he was dead. And I'm like sitting there looking at him going, I don't understand. Like, he's not skinny. He doesn't have worm. Like, what is wrong? And then all of a sudden it clicked. I'm like, oh my goodness, he's completely faded. He was supposed to be this bright red goat, and he was like completely faded to like this light creamy yellow. So that was one of my crazy stories from the early days. My daughter and I cut out the liver and sent it to a lab ourselves. And it came back, the level was 15. Again, should have been 25 to 150. So that's why I don't recommend the injectable, because it doesn't last long term.
So you would do the copper boluses, which I actually have one on my desk right here.
Yeah.
You would do those instead?
Yes.
Once or twice a year?
It depends on your situation. So I always say, watch the goats. So first it was like we had to give them about every 3 months. And then we spent a couple $1,000s on a water treatment system, a chlorine water treatment system. And after that, we only had to do it about every 6 months. And now, for some reason, completely unbeknownst to me, I don't hardly see copper deficiency symptoms at all in them. And I don't know why.
We'll cover minerals, but just really quickly, did you increase the copper content in the loose mineral you provided?
Yes. So that's one of the things. A lot of times people contact me and, they'll say that I've got these problems, and I'm like, well, that sounds like copper deficiency. Oh no, they're getting a mineral. And it's like, well, what brand mineral? Because I have seen everything from like 30 ppm copper, 300 ppm copper. You really need at least 1800 ppm copper. That is one of the things that's really important. And you also need to have enough selenium in there and zinc.
So this is also going to be a section of its own, but you just mentioned that you had resistance to all chemical dewormers available. Did you just go through a period where natural selection kind of took its course, and then you ended up with a stronger, more resistant set of animals naturally?
Yeah, that was what happened. So we wound up with goats that were just naturally resistant. They were the ones that could survive. And we also started doing pasture rotation. And we started kidding in the dead of winter, because we're in Illinois. There's no parasite larva on the grass in the middle of winter. There's no grass for the goats to eat. It's covered with snow. So it was absolutely brutal and horrible. I had a blog at the time, like the old fashioned diary style blogs. And I'd be writing my birth stories in January and February, like so-and-so gave birth. It was 15 below zero. And people would be commenting, why are you letting your goats give birth this time of year? And it's like, well, because we have a problem with dewormer resistance. And if my goats kid in April, they're all going to die from parasites.
We're going to touch on that a lot in the parasite section, because guys, we're going to have an entire segment of this dedicated to parasites. That's going to be one of your biggest challenges as a small ruminant producer. But I'm going to just get to some of the basics here. For those looking to start a homestead, maybe specifically dairy herd, what breeds do they have to choose from based on kind of your recommendation? What would your recommendations be?
I always tell people it really depends on what your goals are. I raise Nigerian dwarfs now. That's what I've had for 22 years. I also had La Manchas for about 8 years. And La Manchas are the ones without ears. So the La Manchas and all the other standard sized dairy goats give a lot more milk, but it's lower butter fat. So according to the American Dairy Goat Association, the breed average for Nigerian dwarfs across the course of their lactation is around 6.5% butter fat. For Nubians, which are a big breed, they have the long floppy ears. Their butter fat average is around 4.5. And then most of the other dairy goats are like around 3.5. And your really big bucket busters like the Saanen and Alpine can be even lower, like closer to 3%. So there's kind of this inverse relationship. You know, what do you want more of, the butter fat or the fluid milk? So, you know, somebody contacted me one time who had a family of like 7 or 8 children. And she said they go through 2 gallons of milk a day. And I said, okay, I love my Nigerians, but you want like Alpines or Saanens or something that's going to give you a lot more milk, because you would be milking a lot of Nigerians to get 2 gallons of milk a day. And that doesn't even leave you any for making cheese or yogurt or any of the other great stuff. The cool thing about that high butter fat is that you get a much higher cheese yield. So when we had the La Manchas, we made cheddar with 100% La Mancha milk and cheddar with the Nigerian milk using the same recipe. And 2 gallons of Nigerian milk, we had a round of cheddar that was about that high. And for the La Mancha milk, the rounded cheddar was only about that high. So it was almost twice as much cheese from the same amount of milk.
Gotcha. So when people are choosing or thinking about a breed, basically they want to pay attention to the butter fat content variations between the breed and decide what's important to them.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So when they're going to buy and start their herd, are there any diseases they should ask the breeder about before buying a dairy goat?
Yeah, you want to make sure that you're getting your goats from herds that have tested negative for CAE, which is caprine arthritis encephalitis, CL, which is casus lymphedema. We're just going to call it CL for now. And Johne's, which weirdly enough is spelled with a J. Mm-hmm. It looks like John's, but it's pronounced Johne's. So those 3 diseases can be totally asymptomatic in the early days. You would not know a goat has them. And they are highly contagious, especially Johne's. Johne's is fecal oral contamination. So if you bring in a goat with Johne's, they're going to poop their Johne's all over your pasture, where it can survive for years. And it is contagious, not just to goats, but sheep and cows. So if you wind up with Johne's in your herd, it's a chronic wasting disease. So they're going to get very, very skinny, and you can't bring in sheep or goats on that pasture. You know, some people say like 4 or 5 years. You don't want to have any ruminants on that pasture because it's contagious to all of them.
Do any of these diseases make the milk unsafe for human consumption?
So that is kind of interesting. Probably not. There is a controversy, though, about whether Johne's can become Crohn's disease in humans. And the thing about Johne's is that pasteurization does not kill it. So to me, that's the great thing about having my own goats. I have a closed herd. They have tested negative for all these diseases year after year. People can argue whether Johne's causes a disease in humans all day long, and I don't have to worry about it because I know my goats are negative for it.
That's good. All right. So guys, you're getting a lot of questions about the parasites. Do not worry. We're going to have an entire section devoted to talking about how Deborah kind of worked and reversed the resistance in her own herds. So that's coming down the line, but we're going to get some of these more general questions. If you're new to the room, we are talking with Deborah Neiman of Raising Goats Naturally. Excellent book, guys. I picked it up last month and have enjoyed it. A lot of crossover information for sheep in there as well. General tips for avoiding goat milk that tastes like a buck. That's what I get all the time when I tell people I want goats for milk.
Interestingly enough, that goaty flavor actually is caused by a completely harmless skin bacteria in goats. So it is goaty. It is the flavor of a goat. There's a couple keys. One is to make sure that you clean the goat's udder before you start milking. And the other one is to put the first few squirts into a strip cup. It's a separate cup. You put 3 or 4 squirts in there, and you can give that milk to the chickens or your barn cats or your livestock guardian dog or somebody who doesn't care how it tastes. And in the beginning, I did not know this. And so we were so confused for the first couple of years. Like sometimes it tasted fine, sometimes it didn't. So really the question was like, well, how much of that bacteria got into the milk? And then weirdly enough, when my youngest daughter was working on her PhD in biological chemistry, she got assigned to create a filter for a dairy in Africa, because apparently if you're don't have good sanitation with cow milk, it tastes really gross too. And so dairies in Africa are getting their milk from small farmers. They're not cleaning the udders. They're not doing first squirts. They're putting it on the back of a bicycle or a pack animal to take it to the dairy. And then it tastes terrible. And for anybody who's wondering, because my question to her was, I'm like, well, don't they pasteurize it since it's a big dairy and they know these farmers are not being great with their hygiene? And she said, yes, but dead bacteria doesn't taste any better than live bacteria.
That is basically going to be what makes it taste bad. It's bacteria and not necessarily the presence of a buck.
Yeah, a buck can definitely make it worse, mostly if he rubs on the udder. Some people are like, oh, you can't have a buck on your farm. Those things don't jump across the fences. But what does happen during breeding season, if a doe has been bred, some bucks like to rub their head against the doe's udder. And that's where all of their stinky comes from, is from their head. And so if he rubs his head on their udder, first of all, you want to go get some rubber gloves to milk her, because your hands are going to smell so terrible after milking her, and the milk is going to be gross. So bucks can make it even worse.
All right. That is really good information, albeit gross. Very good information there. Thank you. All right. So you raised Nigerian dwarfs. What can you expect milk yield per doe at your farm, whether you measure it on a weekly or annual basis?
So it varies depending upon their lactation curve. Commercial dairies freshen their does or their cows yearly, because after freshening, the production starts here and then it goes up, and then it peaks around 2 months, and then it'll stay there for maybe a month or so, and then it'll just gradually start to go down. It might plateau a couple times. What you hear people say a lot about Nigerians is that they average a quart a day. And over the course of standard 10-month lactation, which 305 days is the standard, over the course of 305 days, a quart a day is probably about right. But like at 2 months, my best milkers are producing 3 quarts a day at 2 months, which is what they need to be producing to feed triplets, which a lot of them have.
So anywhere between 1 quart and 3 quarts a day for the Nigerian dwarf?
Yeah, like right now we've got several goats that freshened a year ago, and the ones that freshened 2 years ago are just now freshening again. And so that way you have year-round milk.
Gotcha. We're going to talk about nutrition and parasites tonight before we're done. But number one question on the nutrition. Now, it's obvious nutritional needs will vary from farm to farm, but can you share some baseline nutritional requirements for a dairy goat, protein, amount of feed, etc., for somebody who's just absolutely brand new?
So this is really important. This time of year, I'm getting a lot of questions from people who have a goat that's not producing what they think she should. And my first question is always, what are you feeding her? So dairy goats absolutely have to have alfalfa if you want them to produce enough milk, because grass hay has half as much protein and way less calcium. So for a goat to produce milk, she needs to have a lot of protein. And alfalfa is going to be 16 to 20% protein, whereas grass hay is like 7 or 8%. You also need a lot of calcium, and the alfalfa is going to be your best source of calcium. Now, if you're down south, you could get peanut hay, which is also a legume, clover hay, or Sericea lespedeza is awesome for people that are on the East Coast. You can get Sericea lespedeza. That is fantastic, because that is a legume and it also kills worms and coccidia, which is super cool. Then they also need a 16% protein goat feed. Definitely needs to be goat, and I like to find one that's got at least 35 ppm copper in it and 0.5 selenium. And then you need to have a free choice loose mineral, not a block, not a tub. A lot of those blocks are like 90% salt. And so there's like next to nothing in terms of minerals in them. Good loose mineral, they're only going to need to consume like a 1/4 ounce to 1/2 ounce a day. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people they're like, oh, I don't see my goats eating it, so it must not be good. And then they get a block and they're like, oh, the goats are licking it all day long. And it's like, well, your goats are licking it all day long because they're not getting anything from it. And plus, just looking at like Purina, if you look at their block, it has 1 ppm of selenium in it. Goats can't get much off of it because it's hard and they have a small, soft tongue. Whereas their loose mineral has 50 ppm in it. Mm-hmm. So it's very frustrating to me that this company makes one mineral that's outstanding and one that is a complete waste of money. And, you wind up with animals that are deficient and the people think like, oh, well, that's the best one because the goats are licking the block all day long. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, they're licking it all day long because they can't get what they need.
So people are asking if you have a brand specific mineral mix that you would just refer out to the beginner.
Yeah, Purina goat mineral, the loose one in the bag is good. And also Sweet Licks Meat Maker, specifically the Meat Maker. Again, that's a loose one that's in a bag.
And so just to kind of summarize the nutritional needs, you want to make sure they're at 16 to 20% protein. And would you say that there's a percentage of body weight as far as volume that you want to be feeding them per day?
So the standard recommendation is that a goat should have 1 pound of the goat feed for every 3 pounds of milk she's producing. And so if somebody's got a doe's nursing kids, they're like, but I don't know how much the kids are, I don't know how much she's making because the kids are nursing. So for Nigerian dwarfs, I want my Nigerian dwarf babies to gain 4 ounces a day. By the time they are 2 to 3 weeks old, they're going to be consuming like a quart a day. So by the time your kids are 2 to 3 weeks old, that means that your doe, she's got twins, she should be producing half a gallon. If she's got triplets, she should be producing 3 quarts. So you can get an idea there of how much she's producing. And then of course, if you're milking her, you know what she's producing and you can know what to do with that accordingly. And as long as you're feeding alfalfa, you don't need to get a goat feed that's more than 16% protein because that alfalfa is going to be like 16 to 20. So they'll get a little more protein in there. Also pregnant goats, it's very, very important. And again, this is one of those things where like the old information online just will not die. Too much alfalfa for cows causes hypocalcemia. Mm-hmm. With goats, it is the opposite. Goats need alfalfa so that they don't get hypocalcemia. And the reason is because cows wind up with hypocalcemia after freshening because of how much milk they're producing. And this is just dairy cows because they've been bred to produce so much milk. Dairy goats, on the other hand, have multiple kids. So they need high calcium during pregnancy to grow multiple fetuses.
That makes a lot of sense. So do you raise your goats on pasture at any point during the year? And do you adjust your feed ration when they do have pasture access?
We're in Illinois. So from about mid-April until 1st of November, we've got some decent pasture and we rotationally graze them. And that's our main strategy for controlling parasites. So we've got the electronet and we rotate the goats all over our farm. To keep my kids healthy, the first time they go out on pasture, they actually go out on my front yard. So there are no ruminants on that front yard for 11 months a year. So that when the babies first go out on pasture, it is completely clean. There is no parasite larva out there whatsoever. So they get exposed very, very gradually. And I haven't given a dewormer to a kid in over 10 years since we started doing that. About the only goats on my farm that ever wind up getting a dewormer is if we have a first freshening yearling, because they're still kind of young, their immune system's not very mature yet. And so we're asking a lot of them. It's like, all right, we want you to grow babies, keep growing your own body, make milk, and fight parasites. So I don't hold it against them if they're a yearling and they need a dewormer.
So you'd say you're on pasture maybe 6 months out of the year or 4 months out of the year?
Yeah, about 6 months.
6 months. Okay. All right. Let's segue into the parasites. And we are going to spend a little bit of time on this one, guys, because if you are new to small ruminants, or maybe you're not new to small ruminants, you know that this is a big one. So you mentioned that in your early years, your herd was resistant to all chemical dewormers. How did you work without the chemicals?
So yeah, the chemicals didn't work. So that was just totally off the table. So it was a combination of like learning all the things, the rotational grazing, moving the goats so that they were not eating from their toilet. They're not consuming worm larvae from the eggs that they pooped out last week. Does are most susceptible to worms after they kid. So I still don't put my does on pasture after they kid. They're in the barn when they kid, and then And then they and their babies go out to that pasture that is completely clean when they go out. There's this thing called the periparturient egg rise after they kid. Most of the time, you can get them through that without them needing a dewormer, as long as they're not out there consuming more worm larvae off the pasture and increasing their load. You can do mixed species grazing. We had cows at the time, and we also had horses and pigs. And parasites are species resistant. And when the goats would leave a pasture, then somebody else would come in and graze it, the cows or horses or pigs or something. And they can, if they consume goat worm larvae, they digest it because the goat worms can't survive inside of their bodies.
And for those new to worms, we're talking mostly about the barber's pole worm. Am I right there?
That's the one that causes the most losses because that's the one that causes anemia. And so it can kill a goat so fast. Mm-hmm. Most of the other roundworms that cause problems, you wind up getting a goat that's just like losing weight. You're like, wow, this goat's just getting skinnier. But the thing about the barber pole worm is that it is such a prolific egg layer. One worm can lay 10,000 eggs a day. Now, they do not hatch inside the goat, but what that means is that they get your pasture covered in worm eggs insanely fast. So that's why you got to move them out of there. Like all the other roundworms only lay a few hundred eggs a day. Like that's nothing compared to what a barber pole worm can do.
That's exactly right. And unless you can find the early stages or key in on the early stages, they just drop so fast. They die so fast of this particular worm. So you're saying the biggest things for you to manage it naturally were, number one, rotations, number two, kidding in the winter and keeping those does off of the pasture while they had just kidded and were in that heavy lactation?
Yes, exactly.
Were there any nutritional things that you found helped you with increased worm resistance in your herd?
So one of the only things we were doing right in the beginning, and I just got lucky, this guy pulled into my driveway and said, hey, I got some alfalfa. You want to buy it? And so I was like, sure. I had no clue what the difference was between alfalfa and grass. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that when goats have a diet that is higher in protein, that they have a better resistance to parasites. So the fact that our goats were getting alfalfa was one of the things that helped them. And it's probably why we didn't lose more than we did when the dewormers stopped working, is because they were getting a high protein diet. So if you're just feeding grass hay, for your does, in addition to having lower milk production, you're also going to see more parasite problems. Bucks need grass hay though.
Because of the urinary calculi?
Yeah, urinary calculi. So a lot of people just think, oh, well, you have to balance the calcium and the phosphorus. The thing is, there's 4 different kinds of stones. And when you talk about balancing calcium and phosphorus, you're only talking about struvite stones. The struvite stones are caused by too much grain, but calcium stones are caused by feeding alfalfa to bucks. So you don't want to feed alfalfa to your bucks because they don't need it, and it can cause, not only can it cause stones, it can also cause zinc deficiency because calcium is a zinc antagonist, and bucks don't need calcium. They're not growing babies, they're not making milk, so they don't need all that calcium.
Good one. All right, so I get questions all the time: garlic, diatomaceous earth, herbals. I'm seeing pumpkin seeds in the comments here. People are asking if there's any natural herbal method that has widespread efficacy.
So I tried all of those. I think I tried every single thing you just listed. I also even started growing my own wormwood. I had a big patch of wormwood in my yard. The thing about those things, and the reason that you heard about them historically, like I see somebody put tobacco in the chat, is that they do kill some worms, but not a lot. So like there was research from a long time ago, 50, 60 years ago, where they tested tobacco and found it killed about 40, 50% of worms. And that's what we also found with the wormwood. We did before and after fecals with wormwood. You would see a fecal egg reduction of about 50% if you gave wormwood to a goat. So it depends. If your goat isn't horribly parasitized and you kill half the worms, that might be enough to help them. But if you have an animal that's like down and their eyelids are white, killing 50% of the worms is not going to help them.
Exactly right. Yep, that's exactly true. And take that one seriously, guys. Unless you are wanting to let nature take its course and wipe out whatever can't survive with chemical dewormers, generally, I'm just going to say that the natural stuff is going to do exactly what Deborah just said. It's going to kill some, but not enough to really draw your animal out of a serious issue. So let's go ahead and talk really quickly about Coccidia. We just talked about, guys, if you're new to worms, what we just talked about really covers the barber's pole worm. How do you treat Coccidia at your farm?
So Coccidia actually is not a worm. Coccidia is a parasite. It's a single cell protozoa. So dewormers don't kill it. You need a drug like Corid or something like that to kill Coccidia. It has a completely different life cycle. You see a lot of people talking about putting their kids on medicated feed when they're 3 weeks old, or if they feed milk replacer, they put them on medicated milk replacer when they're 3 weeks old. And that's because the life cycle of Coccidia is about 3 weeks. So if your kid was born into a pile of poop and wound up with Coccidia oocysts in their mouth and got infected on day 1, you could see diarrhea when they're 3 weeks old. And so that's why a lot of people start Coccidia prevention at 3 weeks. We were like a lot of people in the early years, we're like, oh gosh, if one kid gets it, they're all going to get it because they get diarrhea, the poop spreads it. And we did that. And then crazy thing happened over 10 years ago. I fell and smashed my knee. And my husband, who had never helped with the goats before our daughters left for college, was suddenly like the sole caregiver for our goats. And this doe had twins, and he's like, I don't think they're nursing. And I'm like, well, just feel their tummy. It should feel like a little golf ball behind their ribs. And he's like, I don't know what that means. I'm not seeing them nurse. And he's an engineer. And what do engineers do when they want answers? They start looking at data. So he started weighing the kids. And when he started weighing the kids, I was in for such a shocker because it became obvious really fast that some were growing faster than others when there were more than 3. And also what we discovered was that the kids who gained at least 4 ounces a day did not wind up with coccidiosis. So in the last 10 years, we've had 2 kids with coccidiosis because we track the weight gain. We don't let does try to raise more than 3 kids without help because, like I said, they need a quart a day. And a Nigerian that can produce a gallon a day would be like a top 1% milker. Like she would be worth $1,000. She'd be on the top 10 list. They just can't produce that much. And on top of that, you got to have 4 kids that are equally tenacious. And that rarely happens. Even with triplets, sometimes you wind up with one of them standing back in the corner looking like Eeyore with his ears down because it's got 2 pushy big brothers that keep knocking it off the teat. So that's why it's really important the first 2 weeks to weigh them every day and make sure that they are gaining appropriately. So we want to see 4 ounces a day. And if we don't see that, we supplement. And one of those 2 kids that wound up with coccidiosis in the last 10 years was one whose mom was doing okay until the kids were like 3 or 4 weeks old. It was triplets. She was doing okay till the kids were 3 or 4 weeks old. And then she just could not keep up with the amount of milk that they needed at that point. And of course, it's triplets, right? So one kid wound up not getting enough. That's the really important thing. I just cringe when I see people talking about like separating kids overnight when they're 2 weeks old. Because if you do that, there's no way a doe can produce enough milk to feed babies and your family at that time. And so making sure that the kids get enough milk is my definition of health insurance for the babies.
That's a good point. So you notice a direct correlation, and I think you even mentioned a specific amount of weight gain that you look for in your Nigerians every day. And you said you have not treated a kid for coccidia in how many years?
We treated 2 in the last 10 years.
Wow. Now that's incredible for goats. And what's your weight gain threshold per kid per day?
So we want to see 4 ounces a day. And when they are hitting that 4 ounces a day, they will reach 20 pounds by 8 to 10 weeks. And once they reach 20 pounds is when we start separating them overnight and milking the moms.
Very good info. All right. So that's the best way to make sure they're nutritionally getting everything that they need is just monitoring their weight gain. And you would recommend that people do that and make sure the kids are really well on their feet before they start to take milk for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Unless the doe has a single, in which case I say you're the twin that wasn't born. You can milk her dry twice a day if you want to. Because if you don't milk her from the beginning, then you're going to wind up with a really fat kid and a doe with a low milk supply because she's only going to be producing enough for that one kid.
Good information. So guys, if you're having problems with coccidia on your farm, make sure those kids are gaining weight like they should. If somebody finds that their kid crop is not gaining weight adequately, how can they make the mom produce more milk so that they will? Any tips there?
So some of this is genetic. Recently, I was working with somebody and she's got a doe that is a boar Nubian cross. Boars are not bucket busting milkers. They're not dairy goats. And I know you're like, well, she's half Nubian and her mom is a great milker. That doesn't mean she's going to be a great milker. Genetics really does play a role. So if you want milk goats, you need to make sure you've got a breed of milk goats and that you buy from somebody who keeps milk records and can tell you how much their goats are producing. Genetics is number one. You can't make a fantastic milk goat out of a boar. They haven't been bred for that. The other thing is then the amount of protein in the diet. So make sure that she's being fed appropriately.
You also raise sheep, Deborah. So can you give just a general sheep versus goats for people who, maybe like me, who bought dairy goats a couple years ago and thought basically they'd be the same thing? What are some maybe top 3, top 5 differences you need to watch for?
Okay. First of all, sheep have much better parasite resistance than goats for most breeds. Improved in the world of agriculture does not really always meet my definition of improved. Usually the heritage breeds have much better resistance, but in general, my Shetland sheep and my Katahdin sheep, they had no problems with parasites. They are fantastic in terms of parasites. You don't have to try that hard. With them, you're rotating the pasture because it's for pasture utilization. Another thing is that most sheep are like absolute rock stars when it comes to giving birth. We've had like 250 or 300 lambs. I've only seen 2 or 3 sheep give birth, and I haven't need to assist any of them. With the goats, we've had 750 kids. And the goat textbooks say that 95% of goats should not require any assistance. And I agree with that. If you're helping more than 5% of the time, something's wrong. The reason I'm there when my goats give birth is because my goats are divas. Like they think their job is just to push the baby out. There have been times that I've missed a birth. I go out there and I find a kid still has a sack on it. You know, it's suffocated because the mom didn't rip the sack off. So there's that. And then the other thing that I think is really bizarre, I will never understand this. If you try to give a bottle to a dam-raised goat kid, and I mean, it could have been nursing on mom for 6 or 7 hours, you try to give it a bottle, 90% of them will scream and kick and act like you're trying to poison them. And I can go out there and I can give a bottle to any lamb and it starts sucking. I had a set of lambs. Their mom died when they were a month old. I got both of them onto a bottle just like that. No problem. I had triplets whose moms died when they were a month old. It took 5 to 7 days to not have to pry the mouth open, stick the bottle in, hold the mouth closed while they're kicking and screaming and gurgling, and I'm getting milk all over me for 5 to 7 days before they finally were like, oh, fine, I'll take the bottle.
So personality is a big one.
It's huge.
All right, guys. So we are finally at the place where we're going to get to your questions. We got 6 more minutes and we've got a few questions from the audience here. First one is from Crystal. She asks, can you feed bottle lambs or goats cow's milk instead of milk replacer?
Yes, that's fine. As long as it's whole cow's milk, it's fine. Sheep milk is like 9 or 10% butter fat. I have no qualms feeding my Nigerian milk to lambs. I do that all the time. But my Nigerian milk is 6.5% butter fat, and they do great on that. Cow's milk is about 3.5% butter fat. So I'd probably go with a milk replacer for lambs just because it should have a higher butter fat like the used milk does.
Mm-hmm. Good one there. I had a bottle lamb. I was able to use the regular cow's milk, but I added some olive oil to it, about 1.5 tablespoons per 2 cups. And it's been working pretty well for that. Emily asks, can you make kefir with goat's milk?
Yes, you can.
Krista says, do all types of cheeses made from goat's milk have a bite, or are some more sweet and mild?
It totally depends on the type of cheese, and they shouldn't taste goaty.
I guess just as a personal question, will the cheese reflect that good bacteria managing practice that you practice just as a matter of milking and drinking the milk?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're doing that strip cup for the first couple squeezes, getting the bacteria out of the way and then milking, you shouldn't have as much of a bite.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Josh is asking for suggestions on containing his goats for rotational grazing. He is currently doing 4 strands of poly wire, a 3 jewel fence charger. Any tips to keep them in? Currently, these strands are 6 inches apart.
The only thing we've ever used that single strand wire for is for pigs. That keeps them in, no problem. But for the goats, we use electro netting that we get from Premier One.
What kind of energizer do you use for that one?
We've got a solar energizer that we use that goes out in the field. And then we also have one that plugs into the barn. Anything that we can run from the barn, we do. And then the stuff like across the creek or out in the hayfield and stuff like that, we use the solar charger that we got from Premier One.
Emily asks, will chickens help to reduce barber poleworm loads on pasture?
Unfortunately, no, because they can't see them. Joel Salatin really popularized the idea of chickens following cows and reducing parasites. And what that's really reducing is your flies, because they can dig through the cow pies and eat the maggots. I think he does it like about 4 or 5 days after the cows leave. So the fly eggs have time to hatch. And then you've got these big juicy maggots, which add to the chicken's protein in your diet. So unfortunately, the barber pole eggs are microscopic. You have to have a microscope to be able to see them, and the chickens can't see them, so they can't eat them.
That's a really good point, because that's a really good method that Joel Salatin uses, but it's pretty exclusively for the external parasites, like those flies. It doesn't do much for the internals. All right, so the other question was, Jeff says, does too much alfalfa cause bloat in goats?
Not hay. A field of fresh alfalfa and could graze alfalfa all day long, that could make them sick. We had a drought here in 2012, and he came home from church one day and found a bunch of his lambs dead, because in that drought, it killed all the grass, but the clover was still growing. And so he was like, yay, thank goodness for the clover. My lambs have food. But eating nothing but fresh clover from the field killed a bunch of them with bloat.
That's a good one. So they didn't have that balance. So Paul says, do sheep in general handle colder climates better than goats? What's your opinion there, Deborah?
So my goats, the adults do fine. Kidding and lambing, though, in cold weather, yeah, I am blown away by the fact that lambs can survive being born in 10 degrees. A goat would never survive being born in 10 degrees. If it's 10 degrees, you got to be out there with your blow dryer to get them dry as soon as possible. Otherwise, they get hypothermia. The first thing to go when they get hypothermia is their sucking instinct. So,
all right. So Dave says, and you may have already answered this, I'll just ask it again for you to recap. Do you have any recommended natural dewormer, and what dosage?
So copper oxide wire particles have been shown in a lot of different studies to kill barber poleworm. So if barber poleworm is your primary problem, that's the one that causes anemia. Copper oxide wire particles help for that. The other thing that's been studied extensively is Sericea lespedeza. So if you live in the southeastern United States, you may have this growing wild in your pasture. So if somebody's in the southeastern US and says, I don't have any worm problems, it may be because they have that growing in their pasture, but they need to be eating it every day. So it's not like you can give them a tablespoon and it kills the worms. They need to be eating it every day. But it kills worms and Coccidia, which is super cool, because there's nothing else that kills worms and Coccidia both.
I just bought some Sericea lespedeza pellets from New Country Organic. Now, they are just crazy expensive. They're like $70 for a 50-pound bag. But I've just been mixing a little tiny bit in some of the rations I have for the lambs. And I can't say that I've done any fecal egg counts, but if you guys are living in an area where it may not be as accessible, check out New Country Organics if you want to add some Sericea pellets to your ration. Grace asks, suggestion for goat that fights milking or nursing.
Okay, so those are two completely different questions. Typically, if a doe's been raising her kids for 2 months and you've never touched her udder and you put her on the milk stand and touch her udder, she's going to be like, what are you doing? That's for my babies. Get away from there. And she's going to fight you. So I'm just going to address the milking. So for the milking, when we only had a few goats, every doe during pregnancy would get put on the milk stand for like a quarter cup of grain every day. So she knows, like, oh, I jump up here and I get grain. Yay. So then when she kids, she jumps up there and she gets her grain. Don't bother touching their udder before they kid, because they'll kick you and that doesn't mean anything. Once they kid and then they jump on the milk stand, you just practice nursing. So you just get a few squirts while she's eating her grains. If you've got 2-month-old kids already, you really have to take it in baby steps. So first you like shake a pan of grain and lure the goat to jump up on the milk stand. And then once you've done that for a few days, then you just put your hand on her udder and just let her kick. Like she's going to kick like crazy. Just keep your arm out of the way so you don't get hurt. But just let her kick and she'll eventually stop kicking and decide to eat the grain. After doing that for a few days, then you can try milking a little. And then once she's calm, like she's not kicking anymore, like she just jumps up there, eats the grain, you can put your hand on her udder and she's totally fine. Then you can try squeezing her teats a few times. So it's just baby stepping your way to getting her to know like, oh, this is okay. It's not bad.
All right, guys, I am going to close it out here with one more question, and then we are going to have some closing words from Deborah. One question is, Nathan asks a good one. Which dewormers can you use? Say chemicals do work on your farm in dairy goats. I think referring to the withdrawal period for milk.
So you should never use any injectables. So first of all, they're for cows. But if you look on the bottles of injectables, they say not for dairy producing animals. And everybody just assumes, oh, that's because it's not studied. Well, the reality is they did study it. So if you inject ivermectin, I think the milk withdrawal lasts like 45 days. And if you inject Cydectin, it's like 3 or 4 months. Like it is crazy. You're going to be consuming dewormer for months if you inject dewormers into a goat. So you really don't want to do that. There is one, Eprinex is a poron. It is for cattle. It's approved for goats in Europe. So it is not approved for goats in the US, but it's approved for goats in Europe and has a 0 milk withdrawal and kills both internal and external parasites. It's Eprinex, kills both, and there's 0 milk withdrawal on that one.
So injection being under the skin, something that you put in with a needle, am I right?
Correct.
Okay, and then the drenches just go into the throat, and then the porons will go on their back outside on the skin.
Exactly.
All right, thank you so much for your time tonight. Deborah, do you have some closing words of encouragement? Maybe if you could go back to yourself, what would you have told yourself as you were building your homestead herd in the early years? Speak to those people.
If I knew 22 years ago what I know now, I might have not wanted to get goats because I would have thought, oh no, they can't be grass fed and all that kind of stuff. But I'm glad I didn't know everything then because I really love goats. They are so personable. When I talk about the comparison between goats and sheep, sometimes people are like, why do you have goats? And I'm like, because they are such cool animals and because they make the best cheese. Like, I absolutely love the chev. It is just so delicious. And the yogurt is so fantastic, especially maybe from the Nigerian milk because it has such high butter fat. So it's like custard. Because in the winter, their butter fat actually goes up to like 9 or 10%. We learned that when we were on milk test. And so it's fantastic. So the big challenge is all that information that we were using 20 years ago is still out there. And it's really frustrating. Like you think, oh, well, this is something from Purdue University, so it's credible. But I mean, all their citations are from like the early 2000s and the 1900s. The person who wrote that would probably be horrified to know that it's still on the website and Google is still sending people to it. And that's why you find contradictory stuff online because the old stuff is still out there. So unfortunately, it waters down the newer information.
Good one. All right, guys. Deborah Niemann, Raising Goats Naturally. Great book. Pick it up. Deborah, where can people find you and your resources on the internet?
My website is thriftyhomesteader.com. And we also have a membership called Goats 365. In Goats 365, you get access to 6 courses, like a whole course on goat parasites, a whole course on nutrition, a whole course on health and disease, goat basics, and all that stuff. And I'm constantly updating them. There are about 5 to 7 hours of videos in every course. And every month I'm adding more videos to another course, usually in response to a question somebody has.
Perfect. All right, guys. So if you want a virtual goat mentor, go to Deborah's site, thriftyhomesteader.com. Thank you so, so much for spending your evening with me.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun chatting with you.
All right, guys. Next month, I'm super excited to have another co-host, Jack Wolfson of the 100-Year Heart. Going to tie into the raw dairy and natural living and eating thing. So I hope you will join me. Thank you, Deborah. Have a great night.